The fluorescent lights of courtroom 4B cast harsh shadows across the polished wooden benches as Marcus Whitfield adjusted his Italian silk tie with the confidence of a man who had never lost anything that mattered. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit spoke of success, of a life built through determination and brilliance, or so he would have everyone believe. Beside him sat his attorney, the renowned Harrison Webb, whose reputation for demolishing opposition in divorce proceedings was matched only by his astronomical hourly rates. At the plaintiff's table, a woman sat with her hands folded quietly in her lap. Elena Rosario wore a simple navy dress that had seen better days, her dark hair pulled back in a modest ponytail that revealed the early lines of stress around her tired eyes. To any observer, she appeared exactly as Marcus intended, a woman worn down by years of mediocrity, someone who had contributed little and deserved even less. Behind Marcus, in the first row of the gallery, Victoria Blackwood crossed her long legs with practiced elegance. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor as she shifted, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a countdown to victory. At 28, she possessed the kind of stunning beauty that opened doors and wallets alike, and she had already mentally redecorated the penthouse she assumed would soon be theirs alone. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered the courtroom with the measured pace of someone who had presided over countless battles between former lovers. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her sharp blue eyes held the wisdom of 3 decades on the bench. She had seen every type of divorce proceeding imaginable, from amicable splits to bitter wars, but something about this case had caught her attention during the preliminary hearings. Have you ever been in a situation where someone completely underestimated you? Drop a comment below sharing where you're watching from and whether you've experienced something similar. The judge settled into her chair and reviewed the case file one final time before addressing the courtroom. Marcus straightened his shoulders, ready to present his narrative of triumph over adversity, of building an empire from nothing while supporting a wife who had given him little in return. Your Honor, began Harrison Webb, rising with theatrical precision, my client Marcus Whitfield stands before you today as a self-made man who transformed humble beginnings into a multi-million-dollar business empire. Through sheer determination and entrepreneurial genius, he built Whitfield Consulting from a single office into the most prestigious strategic planning firm on the West Coast. Marcus nodded gravely, playing his role to perfection. He had rehearsed this moment countless times, imagining the satisfaction of watching Elena realize how little she meant, how easily she could be discarded. The business he had built represented everything he was, everything he deserved, and he would not allow sentiment or misplaced loyalty to diminish his achievements. Webb continued his opening statement with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to winning. Unfortunately, Your Honor, my client's generosity and loyalty blinded him to the reality of his marriage. While he worked 18-hour days building his company, traveling internationally to secure major contracts, and establishing the reputation that drives today's success, his wife Elena contributed virtually nothing to their household or his professional endeavors. The words hung in the air like poison, each syllable designed to diminish Elena's worth in the eyes of the court. Marcus watched her carefully, expecting to see tears, defeat, or anger. Instead, Elena remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she listened to her contributions being systematically erased from the record. Elena's attorney, Robert Chun, appeared almost apologetic beside his accomplished opponent. His suit was off the rack, his briefcase showed signs of wear, and his modest demeanor suggested someone who typically handled simple wills and minor property disputes rather than complex divorce proceedings involving significant assets. To Victoria, watching from the gallery, he looked like exactly the kind of representation a woman like Elena deserved. Marcus felt compelled to add his own perspective to the proceedings. Your Honor, he said, rising slightly from his chair despite protocol, I want to be completely transparent about the reality of our marriage. Elena has always been content with a simple lifestyle. She never showed interest in my business affairs, never contributed ideas or insights that helped build our success. While I respect her choice to remain uninvolved, I cannot allow that lack of engagement to be rewarded with assets she played no role in creating. The cruelty of his words was masked by reasonable tone and diplomatic language, but their intent was unmistakable. Elena had been nothing more than decorative furniture in his life, pleasant enough to have around, but ultimately replaceable when something better came along. Victoria smiled slightly at Marcus's masterful performance, already imagining their future together without the dead weight of his unambitious wife. Webb produced a folder thick with documentation supporting Marcus's narrative. Financial records showed consistent growth in business revenue, contracts with Fortune 500 companies, and expansion into international markets. Property deeds listed Marcus as the primary owner of their home, vacation properties, and commercial real estate. Investment portfolios bore his signature on every major decision, painting a picture of a man who had built wealth through his own vision and determination. Your Honor, Webb continued, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Mr. Whitfield entered this marriage with entrepreneurial drive and business acumen, while Mrs. Whitfield contributed primarily domestic support that, while appreciated, cannot be valued in the same category as the intellectual and financial capital that created their current assets. Marcus suppressed a smile as he watched Elena's shoulders slump slightly. This was exactly how he had envisioned the proceedings unfolding, with Elena forced to confront the reality of her insignificance while Victoria witnessed his complete dominance over the situation. He had planned every aspect of this moment, from the seating arrangement to the order of evidence presentation, ensuring that everyone present would understand exactly who deserved what. Judge Hendricks studied the documents presented by Webb while making careful notes. Her expression remained neutral, but Marcus interpreted her attention to detail as confirmation that his case was being taken seriously. He exchanged a confident glance with Victoria, who responded with a subtle nod of encouragement. The courtroom fell silent as Webb prepared to present the final piece of his opening argument. Your Honor, he said with dramatic timing, my client requests that this court recognize the reality of contribution versus dependency in this marriage. Mr. Whitfield built everything they possess through his own efforts, and Mrs. Whitfield should receive only what is reasonable for someone who chose to remain financially passive throughout their union. Marcus leaned back in his chair with satisfaction, certain that Elena now understood the futility of challenging his narrative. She had always been quiet, agreeable, and easily overlooked, qualities that had made her pleasant enough as a wife, but useless as a partner in building anything meaningful. Today would simply formalize what had always been true, that she had been along for the ride rather than helping to drive their success. The morning sun streaming through the tall windows caught the gleam of Marcus's wedding ring, which he still wore as a symbol of the commitment he claimed Elena had failed to honor. Soon that ring would be removed, along with all pretense that their marriage had been anything more than his charitable support of someone who lacked the vision to build a meaningful life independently. Victoria adjusted her position slightly, drawing Marcus's attention with her radiant smile. Their future together represented everything he deserved, a partner who matched his ambition and sophistication rather than someone content with mediocrity. Elena would fade into irrelevance where she belonged, while he continued building the empire that bore his name and reflected his capabilities. As Webb concluded his opening statement and returned to his seat, Marcus prepared for the moment when Elena's attorney would present whatever feeble defense they had managed to construct. He almost felt sorry for Chun, who appeared to be preparing for a battle he was destined to lose against superior resources and overwhelming evidence. The dismissal was complete, the narrative established, and Marcus Whitfield sat in his courtroom throne ready to claim everything he believed he had earned through his own magnificent efforts. Judge Hendricks adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the preliminary documentation, her methodical approach contrasting sharply with Marcus's eager anticipation for vindication. The courtroom maintained its oppressive silence while Webb prepared to present the detailed timeline that would, in his estimation, definitively prove Elena's negligible contributions to their marital success. Your Honor, Webb began, rising with renewed confidence, I would like to walk the court through the chronological development of Mr. Whitfield's business empire to demonstrate the clear pattern of individual achievement versus spousal dependency that characterized this marriage from its earliest days. Marcus straightened his tie again, a nervous habit disguised as confidence, while Elena remained motionless in her chair. Her stillness was becoming increasingly noticeable to Judge Hendricks, who had observed countless defendants and plaintiffs over the years. Most people fidgeted, whispered to their attorneys, or showed visible reactions to testimony. But Elena possessed an almost preternatural calm that suggested either defeat or something far more interesting. The timeline begins in 2018, Webb continued, when Mr. Whitfield graduated summa cum laude from Stanford Business School with his MBA and immediately secured a position at McKinsey & Company. During this period, while my client worked 16-hour days establishing his professional reputation, Mrs. Whitfield was content to work part-time at a local bookstore, showing no interest in career advancement or professional development. Elena's eyes flickered slightly at the mention of the bookstore, the first sign of emotion she had displayed since entering the courtroom. Victoria noticed the reaction and smiled, interpreting it as confirmation that Elena was finally grasping the magnitude of her inadequacy compared to Marcus's achievements. Marcus took the opportunity to elaborate on his narrative. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the practiced modulation of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations, Elena always seemed satisfied with simple work that required no real responsibility or growth. While I was building relationships with Fortune 500 executives and developing the strategic frameworks that would later become Whitfield Consulting's signature methodology, she was content to shelve books and recommend novels to customers. The condescension in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, designed to paint Elena as someone who lacked ambition or intellectual curiosity. Judge Hendricks made a note while Elena's attorney, Robert Chun, shuffled through his papers with what appeared to be growing concern about his ability to counter such a comprehensive attack on his client's character. Webb produced a series of documents that painted Marcus as a visionary entrepreneur. Bank statements showed his McKinsey salary being carefully saved and invested. Business plans outlined his strategic thinking for the consulting firm he intended to establish, and professional recommendations from colleagues praised his innovative approaches to organizational development. By 2020, Webb continued, Mr. Whitfield had accumulated sufficient capital and professional connections to launch Whitfield Consulting. During this crucial startup phase, when every decision could determine success or failure, Mrs. Whitfield showed no interest in contributing to the business planning, marketing strategies, or client development that required intense focus and expertise. Marcus nodded gravely, his expression suggesting profound disappointment in Elena's failure to rise to the occasion when her support might have mattered. Victoria leaned forward slightly, captivated by the masterful way Marcus was demolishing any claim Elena might have to their shared assets. "Your Honor," Marcus added, his tone heavy with regret, "I repeatedly invited Elena to participate in business discussions, to share ideas about company direction, to attend networking events where her presence might have been beneficial. She consistently declined, preferring to spend her evenings reading or watching television rather than engaging with the professional challenges that ultimately created our financial security." The cruelty of his words was enhanced by their reasonable delivery, making Elena appear lazy and disengaged rather than simply different in her interests and approach to life. Chun shifted uncomfortably in his chair, apparently struggling to formulate a defense against such systematic character assassination. Webb presented additional evidence of Marcus's individual achievements. Client testimonials praised his transformative impact on their organizations. Revenue reports showed consistent growth year after year, and industry awards recognized his innovative consulting methodologies. Each document reinforced the narrative of a self-made success story unmarred by meaningful spousal contribution. Judge Hendricks studied the materials carefully while observing Elena's continued composure. Something about the woman's demeanor intrigued her, a quality that suggested depth beneath the surface of apparent defeat. The judge had learned to trust her instincts about people over 3 decades of legal practice, and Elena Rosario was not quite fitting the profile Webb was attempting to establish. During the critical expansion phase of 2021 and 2022, Webb continued, when Whitfield Consulting secured major contracts with Tesla, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services, Mrs. Whitfield maintained her part-time bookstore position and showed no interest in the business decisions that ultimately tripled their household income within 18 months. Marcus allowed himself a small smile at the mention of his most prestigious clients. Those contracts represented the pinnacle of his professional achievement, validation of his strategic brilliance, and proof that he belonged among the business elite. Elena had been nothing more than a witness to his triumph, someone who benefited from his success without contributing to its creation. Victoria's admiration for Marcus intensified as she listened to the recitation of his accomplishments. She had initially been attracted to his wealth and status, but hearing the detailed account of how he had built his empire made her appreciate the intellectual superiority that had made such success possible. Elena's passivity throughout their marriage now seemed almost criminal in its waste of opportunity. Webb produced financial records showing Marcus's personal investment in business expansion, his strategic reinvestment of profits for growth, and his careful management of cash flow during challenging periods. Every decision bore his signature, every strategic choice reflected his judgment, and every success story emerged from his individual efforts. "Your Honor," Marcus testified, his voice carrying genuine emotion, "Elena's contentment with mediocrity became increasingly frustrating as my business grew. While I was negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts and developing solutions for complex organizational challenges, she seemed satisfied with discussing book recommendations and planning simple dinners. I began to realize that we had fundamentally different approaches to life and achievement." The subtle shift in his testimony from disappointment to incompatibility was masterfully executed, suggesting that their divorce was inevitable once Elena's limitations became apparent. Judge Hendricks noticed the rhetorical sophistication of Marcus's presentation while continuing to observe Elena's mysterious composure. Chen finally spoke, his voice barely rising above a whisper as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to reserve my response until we have reviewed all of the documentation being presented by opposing counsel. However, I do have some questions about the timeline being established here, particularly regarding the initial funding sources for Mr. Whitfield's business ventures." Marcus's expression darkened slightly at the suggestion that his narrative might contain gaps or inconsistencies. Webb quickly intervened to maintain momentum. "Your Honor, we have comprehensive documentation for every aspect of Mr. Whitfield's business development, including detailed financial records showing his careful accumulation of startup capital through salary savings and strategic investments." Elena's first movement in over an hour was to reach into her modest handbag and retrieve a small leather notebook. Judge Hendricks watched with interest as Elena opened the notebook and appeared to review handwritten entries with quiet concentration. The action was so subtle that most observers missed it, but the judge's trained eye caught the moment of purposeful engagement. Victoria noticed Elena's movement and whispered something to Marcus, who glanced back with irritation at his wife's apparent attempt to appear organized and involved. To him, the notebook was probably another example of Elena's tendency toward meaningless busy work, the kind of superficial activity that substituted for real accomplishment or meaningful contribution. Webb concluded his presentation of the timeline with a flourish. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly demonstrates that from 2018 through the present day, Mr. Whitfield has been the sole architect of their financial success. Mrs. Whitfield's choice to remain professionally stagnant and personally disengaged from the business activities that created their wealth cannot be ignored when determining appropriate asset distribution." Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as Webb returned to his seat. The pattern of Elena's inadequacy had been established with mathematical precision, leaving no room for reasonable dispute about who deserved what from their marriage. Soon this uncomfortable charade would end, and he could begin his new life with Victoria, a woman who understood ambition and appreciated success. The morning light streaming through the courthouse windows seemed to illuminate Marcus's confidence while casting Elena in shadow, a visual metaphor that perfectly captured the narrative Webb had constructed. Judge Hendricks made final notes about the timeline presentation while preparing to hear Chin's response to the systematic demolition of his client's character and contributions. Elena closed her notebook with the same quiet precision she had used to open it, her movements suggesting familiarity with organization and careful record-keeping that contrasted sharply with Marcus's portrayal of her as disorganized and disengaged. The small action went largely unnoticed, But Judge Hendricks filed the observation away for future consideration as the proceedings continued to unfold in ways that might prove more interesting than anyone yet suspected. Judge Hendricks leaned forward in her chair as Robert Chen rose to address the court, his previously apologetic demeanor replaced by something approaching quiet determination. The transformation was subtle but noticeable, like watching someone step out of shadow into light, and it caught the attention of everyone present except Marcus, who remained focused on his anticipated victory. "Your Honor," Chen began, his voice carrying newfound authority, "I appreciate the detailed timeline presented by opposing counsel, but I believe there are some critical gaps in the narrative that require immediate clarification. Specifically, I would like to examine the incorporation documents for Whitfield Consulting more closely, particularly the sections dealing with initial capitalization and founding partnership structures." Marcus's confident expression faltered slightly as Chun produced a manila folder that appeared far more substantial than his previous materials. Webb shifted in his seat, surprised by the sudden shift in his opponent's approach from defensive to methodically investigative. Victoria noticed the change in courtroom atmosphere and found herself paying closer attention to proceedings she had assumed were merely formality. Chen approached the witness stand where Marcus sat with documents in hand. "Mr. Whitfield," he said with polite precision, "according to your testimony, you accumulated startup capital for Whitfield Consulting through salary savings from your position at McKinsey & Company. Is that correct?" "Absolutely," Marcus replied, though his voice carried a hint of irritation at having his carefully established narrative questioned. "I was extremely disciplined about saving and investing my income to build the foundation for my business venture." Chen nodded thoughtfully before consulting his notes. According to the California Secretary of State filing for Whitfield Consulting, the company was incorporated on March 15, 2020, with initial capitalization of $2.7 million. Does that figure sound accurate to you? Marcus hesitated for just a moment, a pause so brief that most observers missed it entirely. Judge Hendricks, however, had spent decades watching witnesses navigate between truth and convenience, and she recognized the telltale signs of someone recalculating their prepared responses. "That sounds approximately correct," Marcus answered carefully, though he was beginning to wonder where Chun was leading with these seemingly mundane questions about business formation details. Chen produced a document from his folder and approached the bench. "Your Honor, I would like to submit McKinsey & Company salary records for Mr. Whitfield covering the period from June 2018 through March 2020, obtained through proper legal channels with Mr. Whitfield's written authorization provided during discovery." Webb stood immediately, his smooth confidence replaced by sharp concern. "Objection, Your Honor. These salary records were not part of the agreed-upon discovery materials, and their relevance to divorce proceedings has not been established." Judge Hendricks examined the documents Chun had presented while considering the objection. "Mr. Chun," she said, "please explain to the court how Mr. Whitfield's McKinsey salary records relate to the asset distribution questions before us today." "Your Honor," Chun replied with growing confidence, "these records are directly relevant because they demonstrate whether Mr. Whitfield could have realistically accumulated $2.7 million in startup capital through salary savings alone during the 21-month period between his graduation and company incorporation." The courtroom fell silent as the mathematical implications of Chen's question became apparent to everyone present. Marcus felt his first genuine moment of concern since entering the courthouse, though he maintained his composed exterior while internally calculating whether his prepared narrative could withstand detailed financial scrutiny. Elena remained perfectly still, but Judge Hendricks noticed that her earlier composure now seemed less like defeat and more like patient waiting. There was something almost predatory about her stillness, like a chess player who had been allowing her opponent to advance across the board before revealing a carefully planned counterattack. Chun continued his methodical approach. "According to these authenticated salary records, Mr. Whitfield earned a total of $347,000 during his McKinsey employment, before taxes, living expenses, and other obligations." "Your Honor, even with the most aggressive saving habits, this figure makes it mathematically impossible for Mr. Whitfield to have personally accumulated the capital required for Whitfield Consulting's incorporation." Marcus's mind raced as he tried to formulate an explanation that would preserve his narrative without contradicting documented evidence. His Italian silk tie suddenly felt constricting as sweat began to form along his hairline despite the courthouse's efficient air conditioning system. Webb requested a brief recess to consult with his client, but Judge Hendricks denied the motion with a slight shake of her head. The momentum of discovery was building towards something significant, and she intended to see where Chin's investigation would lead without interruption. Mr. Whitfield, Chun continued, addressing Marcus directly. If your McKinsey salary was insufficient to provide Whitfield Consulting's initial capitalization, could you please explain to the court where the additional funding originated? Victoria watched Marcus's struggle with growing alarm. The confident man who had dismissed Elena so easily moments earlier now appeared uncertain and defensive, characteristics she had never associated with him during their relationship. Her mental redecorating of the penthouse began to feel premature. I had other income sources, Marcus said finally, his voice lacking the authority that had characterized his earlier testimony. Investment returns, some family assistance, various financial instruments that provided additional capital for the business venture. Chin nodded as if he had expected exactly that response. Your Honor, I would like to present additional documentation that sheds light on these other income sources Mr. Whitfield has mentioned. Elena opened her leather notebook again and made what appeared to be a small check mark beside one of her handwritten entries. The gesture was so understated that only Judge Hendricks noticed it, but the timing suggested Elena was tracking the progress of Chin's questioning with specific expectations about how the testimony would unfold. Chin approached Marcus with another document. Mr. Whitfield, do you recognize this bank transfer record showing a deposit of $2.2 million into your personal account on February 28, 2020, just 2 weeks before Whitfield Consulting's incorporation? The color drained from Marcus's face as he stared at the document Chun had presented. Webb leaned forward to examine the evidence, his own expression growing increasingly concerned as he realized his client had failed to disclose crucial information during case preparation. Yes, Marcus admitted reluctantly, that deposit was part of the funding I mentioned for the business startup. And could you tell the court the source of this $2.2 million deposit? Chin asked with the patience of someone who already knew the answer to his question. Marcus glanced desperately toward Elena, seeing her for the first time since entering the courtroom as something other than a negligible obstacle to his desires. She met his gaze with an expression of calm expectation, as if she were waiting for him to acknowledge something they both understood perfectly well. The deposit came from my wife's account, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible in the suddenly silent courtroom. Victoria felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The empire Marcus had claimed to build through his own genius and determination had been funded by the quiet woman he had spent the morning systematically humiliating and dismissing as worthless. Judge Hendricks made careful notes while observing the dramatic change in courtroom dynamics. Chen had methodically dismantled Marcus's central narrative with simple documentation, revealing either deliberate deception or willful self-delusion about the true source of his business success. Elena closed her notebook and placed it carefully back in her handbag, her movements suggesting satisfaction with Chin's progress rather than surprise at the revelations. Judge Hendricks was beginning to suspect that Elena Rosario was far more involved in orchestrating these proceedings than her modest appearance and quiet demeanor had initially suggested. Chen pressed his advantage with surgical precision. Mr. Whitfield, you testified earlier that Mrs. Whitfield contributed virtually nothing to your business success. In light of this $2.2 million funding from her personal account, would you like to revise that statement? Marcus struggled to maintain his composure while searching for an explanation that would preserve some vestige of his narrative. The funding was temporary, he said desperately, a loan that was intended to be repaid once the business became profitable. Chen nodded thoughtfully before producing yet another document from his seemingly endless folder. Your Honor, I would like to present the loan agreement Mr. Whitfield has referenced, which should detail the terms and repayment schedule for this temporary funding arrangement. The silence that followed Chen's request was deafening. Marcus stared at the attorney with the growing realization that no such loan agreement existed, because Elena's funding had been given freely as support for what she believed was their shared future together. Webb finally found his voice to object. Your Honor, this line of questioning has moved far beyond the scope of divorce asset distribution and into areas that were not anticipated during discovery preparation. Judge Hendricks considered the objection carefully before responding. Mr. Webb, the source and ownership of funds used to establish the primary marital asset seems directly relevant to questions about how that asset should be distributed. I will allow Mr. Chun to continue his examination. Marcus felt the walls of his carefully constructed narrative collapsing around him as Chun prepared to reveal whatever additional evidence Elena and her seemingly modest attorney had prepared for this moment of reckoning. The courthouse air seemed to grow thinner as Chun reached into his folder once more, his movements deliberate and unhurried like a surgeon selecting the precise instrument for a critical procedure. Marcus watched with growing dread as his opponent produced a thick stack of documents bound with a blue legal backing that suggested official authentication and irrefutable legitimacy. Your Honor, Chin announced, his voice carrying newfound authority that commanded absolute attention from everyone present. I would like to present comprehensive banking records from Rosario Family Trust, spanning the period from January 2018 through March 2024, which will illuminate the true source of funding for what Mr. Whitfield has claimed as his self-made business empire. Elena's maiden name fell across the courtroom like a revelation, causing Victoria to straighten in her seat with the sudden realization that the woman Marcus had dismissed so contemptuously might possess resources and connections far beyond anything they had imagined. Judge Hendricks leaned forward with obvious interest as Chun approached the bench with documentation that promised to fundamentally reshape their understanding of the marriage's financial dynamics. Marcus felt his throat constrict as memories flooded back of conversations he had dismissed or ignored during their courtship and early marriage. Elena had mentioned family wealth occasionally, but her modest lifestyle and simple preferences had led him to assume she was exaggerating or referring to middle-class comfort rather than genuine affluence. The possibility that he had fundamentally misunderstood his wife's financial position was becoming terrifyingly real. Webb attempted one final objection. Your Honor, these trust documents appear to introduce entirely new evidence that was not disclosed during discovery, and their relevance to divorce proceedings has not been established. Judge Hendricks examined the documents Chun had presented before responding with crisp authority. Mr. Webb, your client has spent considerable time today establishing his narrative of self-made success versus spousal dependency. Evidence regarding the actual funding sources for marital assets is not only relevant, but essential for proper asset distribution. I will allow this evidence to be presented. Chun nodded gratefully before turning to address Marcus directly. Mr. Whitfield, are you familiar with the Rosario Family Trust, established in 1987 by Elena's grandfather after the sale of Rosario Construction and Development to Bechtel Corporation? The question hung in the air like an accusation as Marcus struggled to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about Elena's background. His confident dismissal of her contributions suddenly seemed not just cruel, but profoundly ignorant of realities that should have been impossible to miss. I was not aware of the specific details, Marcus admitted quietly, his voice barely audible as the magnitude of his miscalculation began to dawn on him. Elena had never discussed her family's business history in terms that suggested major corporate transactions or generational wealth. Chun consulted his notes with the satisfaction of someone whose careful preparation was finally bearing fruit. According to these authenticated documents, the Rosario Family Trust was established with assets exceeding $47 million from the construction company sale, with Elena designated as the primary beneficiary upon reaching age 25 in 2019. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the woman she had pitted and dismissed as unworthy competition possessed wealth that dwarfed anything Marcus had achieved through his consulting business. Her mental calculations of their future lifestyle together were becoming increasingly irrelevant as Elena's true position was revealed. Elena remained perfectly composed throughout Chin's revelations, her earlier stillness now appearing less like defeat and more like the patience of someone who had been waiting for the appropriate moment to reveal carefully guarded truths. Judge Hendricks was beginning to understand that Elena Rosario was not the passive victim Marcus had portrayed, but rather someone who had been systematically underestimated by people who confused quiet dignity with weakness. Chun produced additional documentation that painted an increasingly comprehensive picture of Elena's financial sophistication. Your Honor, these records show that Mrs. Rosario made strategic disbursements from her trust beginning in early 2020, providing not only the initial $2.7 million for Whitfield Consulting's incorporation, but an additional $4.3 million over the subsequent 2 years to fund business expansion, office leases, equipment purchases, and employee salaries. Marcus stared at the documents with growing horror as he realized that virtually every aspect of his business success had been subsidized by Elena's family wealth. The prestigious office space he had attributed to his business acumen, the cutting-edge technology that had impressed clients, the talented staff he had recruited with competitive salaries. All of it had been made possible by resources Elena had provided without fanfare or recognition. Mr. Whitfield, Chun continued with relentless precision, Mrs. Rosario's trust disbursements total $7.2 million in direct funding for your business ventures. Are you prepared to testify that these funds constituted loans with formal repayment agreements? The silence that followed was deafening as Marcus confronted the impossibility of his position. Elena had never demanded repayment terms, interest schedules, or even formal acknowledgement of her contributions because she had believed they were building something together as partners in marriage and business. Webb whispered urgently to his client, but Marcus seemed unable to respond coherently to the systematic destruction of his carefully crafted narrative. The empire he had claimed to build through individual genius was revealed as a construction project funded entirely by his wife's generational wealth and managed with her quiet oversight. Elena opened her leather notebook and made another small notation, her movements suggesting she was checking items off a carefully planned agenda rather than reacting to unexpected developments. Judge Hendricks watched with fascination as the woman who had appeared defeated just hours earlier was revealed as the primary architect of the financial success Marcus had claimed as his own achievement. Chun approached the witness stand with one final document that would complete Elena's transformation from victim to victor. Mr. Whitfield, I would like you to examine this signature page from Whitfield Consulting's original incorporation documents, specifically focusing on the section designated for founding partners and their respective ownership percentages. Marcus took the document with trembling hands as he confronted evidence he had somehow managed to forget or rationalize away during years of believing his own mythology. Elena's signature appeared beside his own on the partnership agreement, with ownership percentages that reflected her majority funding of the business venture. According to this legally binding partnership agreement, Chun continued with quiet triumph. Mrs. Rosario owns 68% of Whitfield Consulting, with Mr. Whitfield holding the remaining 32%. Is this your understanding of the current ownership structure? Victoria stood abruptly and walked toward the courtroom exit, her earlier confidence replaced by the humiliation of realizing she had been pursuing a man whose wealth and status belonged primarily to the wife he was attempting to discard. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor with staccato urgency as she abandoned the proceedings that were no longer developing in her favor. Marcus watched Victoria's departure with the growing understanding that his carefully planned new life was collapsing along with his business narrative. The woman he had assumed would be impressed by his success was fleeing from the revelation that he possessed little of what he had claimed to own. Elena's expression remained serene throughout the courtroom drama, but Judge Hendricks noticed a subtle shift in her posture that suggested quiet satisfaction rather than surprise at the proceedings' development. The transformation was remarkable, from apparent victim to revealed authority, accomplished without theatrics or emotional displays. Chun consulted his notes one final time before addressing the court. Your Honor, the evidence clearly demonstrates that Mrs. Rosario is not only the primary funding source for all marital assets, but also the majority owner of the business enterprise Mr. Whitfield has claimed as his individual achievement. The narrative of spousal dependency appears to be precisely reversed from what opposing counsel has presented. Webb made a final desperate attempt to salvage his case. Your Honor, even if Mrs. Whitfield provided funding for business ventures, Mr. Whitfield's management and strategic leadership were essential for transforming that funding into profitable enterprises. Elena spoke for the second time since entering the courtroom, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. Your Honor, I would like to address that point directly, if the court will permit. Judge Hendricks nodded with obvious interest as Elena rose from her chair with the composed dignity of someone who had been waiting patiently for the appropriate moment to speak. The quiet woman who had endured hours of systematic dismissal was preparing to reveal the full extent of Marcus's misconceptions about their marriage and business partnership. Marcus stared at his wife with the growing realization that he had never truly understood who Elena was or what she was capable of accomplishing. The empire he had claimed to build was not only funded by her family wealth, but apparently guided by her strategic insights in ways he had failed to recognize or acknowledge. The courtroom fell silent as Elena prepared to speak, her transformation from victim to authority complete and undeniable. Elena stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years observing before choosing the perfect moment to act, her modest navy dress suddenly appearing less like defeat and more like the deliberate choice of someone who understood that true power required no ostentatious display. Judge Hendricks watched with fascination as the woman who had endured hours of systematic humiliation transformed into the composed executive she had apparently always been beneath Marcus's willful blindness. Your Honor, Elena began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to boardroom presentations rather than the submissive tone Marcus had described throughout their marriage. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify several misunderstandings that have characterized my husband's testimony today. Marcus stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, which was perhaps closer to the truth than he cared to admit. The woman speaking to the court bore little resemblance to the passive figure he had married, or more accurately, the passive figure he had convinced himself he had married while ignoring evidence to the contrary. Elena consulted her leather notebook with the precision of someone referencing carefully organized documentation rather than casual personal notes. Your Honor, while Mr. Whitfield has portrayed himself as the architect of our business success, the reality is that every major strategic decision for Whitfield Consulting was made jointly, with my family trust providing not only funding but also the established relationships that secured our most significant client contracts. Webb shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Elena's testimony systematically undermined every aspect of the case he had presented with such confidence just hours earlier. The narrative of Marcus's individual genius was being replaced by evidence of collaborative partnership that his client had either forgotten or deliberately misrepresented. Elena approached the witness stand with documents that complemented Chin's earlier presentations. Your Honor, I would like to submit correspondence between myself and the executive teams at Tesla, Microsoft, and Amazon Web Services, demonstrating that these contracts Mr. Whitfield has claimed as his individual achievements were actually secured through my family's long-standing business relationships in the construction and development industries. Marcus felt his remaining confidence evaporate as Elena presented email chains showing her direct communication with corporate decision-makers who had known her family for decades. The prestigious client base he had attributed to his superior sales ability had been cultivated through Elena's networking and relationship management rather than his persuasive presentations. Judge Hendricks examined the correspondence with obvious interest, noting the professional tone and strategic sophistication that characterized Elena's communications with Fortune 500 executives. The contrast between Marcus's portrayal of his wife as intellectually limited and the evidence of her business acumen was becoming impossible to reconcile. Elena continued her methodical destruction of Marcus's narrative with calm precision. Your Honor, Mr. Whitfield's characterization of me as disinterested in business affairs is particularly puzzling given that I attended Stanford Graduate School of Business alongside him, graduating magna cum laude with concentrations in strategic management and corporate finance. The revelation landed like a physical blow to Marcus's solar plexus as he confronted memories he had somehow managed to suppress or rationalize away during years of constructing his mythology. Elena had not only attended business school with him, but had consistently outperformed him academically, while he focused on networking and social activities that he had assumed were more valuable than actual scholarship. Webb made a desperate attempt to object, but Judge Hendricks silenced him with a raised hand, while continuing to study Elena's documentation. The systematic revelation of Elena's qualifications and contributions was transforming the entire legal proceeding from divorce settlement to fraud investigation. Elena produced additional evidence that painted Marcus's claims as either delusional or deliberately deceptive. Your Honor, I would also like to present the original business plan for Whitfield Consulting, which shows my name as primary author and strategic architect, with Mr. Whitfield listed as operations manager and client relations specialist. Marcus stared at the business plan with growing horror as he remembered their collaborative work on the document that had launched their company. Elena had drafted the strategic framework, competitive analysis, and financial projections while he had contributed client presentation materials and marketing concepts. Somehow he had convinced himself over the years that her foundational work had been merely supportive rather than essential. Elena's transformation was now complete, from dismissed victim to revealed authority, and she addressed the court with the confidence of someone who had been systematically underestimated by people who confused quiet competence with weakness. Your Honor, Mr. Whitfield's memory of our partnership appears to be highly selective, focusing on his public-facing activities while minimizing or forgetting the strategic planning and relationship management that actually created our business success. Judge Hendricks made careful notes while observing Marcus's obvious distress at having his carefully constructed narrative systematically dismantled by the woman he had spent the morning humiliating. The irony was almost poetic in its justice, but the legal implications were serious enough to warrant immediate attention. Elena consulted her notebook again before delivering what appeared to be her final revelation. Your Honor, I should also mention that Mr. Whitfield's assertion about my lack of professional ambition is contradicted by the fact that I have been serving as Chief Executive Officer of Rosario Development Corporation since 2021, overseeing a portfolio of commercial real estate and infrastructure projects valued at over $200 million. The silence that followed Elena's announcement was absolute, as everyone present attempted to process the magnitude of Marcus's misconceptions about his wife's professional status. He had been dismissing her as an underachiever while she was apparently managing business operations that dwarfed his consulting firm in both scope and financial significance. Marcus attempted to speak, but found himself unable to formulate coherent responses to revelations that challenged every assumption he had made about Elena's capabilities and achievements. The woman he had married was not the passive figure he had convinced himself to see, but rather someone whose professional accomplishments exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. Chen seized the opportunity to drive home Elena's complete vindication. Your Honor, Mrs. Rosario's management of the family business demonstrates not only her executive capabilities, but also her deliberate choice to support Mr. Whitfield's career development rather than focusing exclusively on her own professional advancement. Elena nodded gratefully at Chen's characterization before addressing the court directly. Your Honor, I chose to provide funding and support for what I believed was our shared business venture because I valued our partnership and wanted to see Marcus succeed. His characterization of my contributions as negligible or non-existent is both factually incorrect and personally devastating. Judge Hendricks studied the mountain of evidence Elena and Chun had presented while considering the legal implications of Marcus's apparent perjury regarding his business ownership and funding sources. The transformation of the proceedings from simple divorce settlement to complex fraud investigation was requiring careful consideration of multiple legal issues. Elena returned to her seat with the composed dignity of someone who had accomplished exactly what she had intended from the moment she entered the courtroom. Her patient endurance of Marcus's humiliation had been strategic rather than passive, allowing him to commit fully to a narrative that could be systematically destroyed through careful documentation. Marcus sat in stunned silence as he confronted the complete collapse of everything he had believed about himself, his marriage, and his business success. The empire he had claimed to build through individual genius belonged primarily to the woman he had dismissed as worthless, and the future he had planned with Victoria was evaporating along with his credibility. Webb whispered urgently to his client about damage control strategies, but Marcus seemed incapable of formulating responses to the systematic revelation that his entire adult life had been built on misconceptions and willful blindness to his wife's true capabilities and contributions. Judge Hendricks prepared to deliver preliminary rulings that would reflect the dramatic reversal in understanding about asset ownership and business partnerships that Elena's testimony had accomplished. The quiet woman who had endured systematic humiliation was about to receive the justice that her patience and preparation had made possible. Elena opened her notebook one final time and made a small notation that suggested completion of a carefully planned agenda rather than surprise at the proceedings' development. Her transformation from victim to victor was now complete, accomplished through methodical revelation rather than emotional confrontation, proving that true strength sometimes required strategic patience rather than immediate retaliation. 6 months after the divorce proceedings that had transformed Elena Rosario from dismissed victim to revealed empress of a business empire, the corner office of Rosario Development Corporation hummed with the quiet efficiency of an organization finally operating under its rightful leadership. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered sweeping views of the San Francisco Bay, where construction cranes marked the progress of 3 major infrastructure projects that Elena had personally negotiated and overseen since assuming full control of her family's legacy. Elena sat behind an imposing mahogany desk that had belonged to her grandfather, reviewing quarterly reports that demonstrated the remarkable growth achieved when strategic vision was no longer constrained by Marcus's limited understanding of true business development. The woman who had endured systematic humiliation in a courthouse now commanded respect from Fortune 500 executives, city planning commissioners, and federal contracting officers who recognized competence regardless of its packaging. Her assistant knocked softly before entering with the afternoon's priority correspondence. "Ms. Rosario," she announced with obvious respect, "the Seattle Port Authority has approved your infrastructure proposal, and the mayor's office has requested a meeting about the affordable housing initiative you outlined last month." Elena nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning was yielding results that benefited entire communities rather than simply generating consulting fees for privileged executives. The affordable housing project represented everything Marcus had failed to understand about sustainable business development, creating long-term value through collaborative relationships rather than extractive consulting arrangements. Meanwhile, across the city in a cramped studio apartment above a Vietnamese restaurant, Marcus Whitfield struggled with the reality of his transformed circumstances. The Italian silk ties had been sold months ago along with most of his designer wardrobe, replaced by department store clothing appropriate for his position as a junior analyst at a mid-tier consulting firm that specialized in small business efficiency reviews. His current assignment involved reviewing inventory management systems for local restaurants and retail establishments, work that required none of the strategic brilliance he had convinced himself he possessed during his years of managing Elena's business empire. The contrast between his former lifestyle and present reality was a daily reminder of how thoroughly he had misunderstood the source of his previous success. Marcus checked his phone for messages from Victoria, though he knew she had stopped responding to his calls weeks ago. Their relationship had ended abruptly when she realized that his assets belonged primarily to Elena and that his future prospects involved rebuilding from nothing rather than managing inherited wealth. The woman who had seemed so attracted to his success had vanished the moment that success was revealed as borrowed rather than earned. At Rosario Development Corporation, Elena was concluding a video conference with executives from Bechtel Corporation, the same company that had purchased her grandfather's construction business decades earlier. The relationship had come full circle as Bechtel now sought partnership opportunities with the granddaughter who had inherited both financial resources and strategic acumen that made her an invaluable collaborator on major infrastructure projects. Elena's management style differed dramatically from Marcus's approach to business relationships. Where he had focused on impressive presentations and persuasive rhetoric, she emphasized collaborative problem-solving and long-term partnership development. Her employees appreciated the respect and professional development opportunities she provided, creating loyalty and productivity that Marcus had never achieved despite his confident leadership rhetoric. The transformation was evident in every aspect of Rosario Development Corporation's operations. Elena had restructured the organization to emphasize sustainable development practices, community engagement, and employee advancement programs that attracted top talent from across the construction and development industries. The company's reputation for ethical business practices and innovative project management had generated contract opportunities that far exceeded anything Marcus had accomplished with Whitfield Consulting. Elena's phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Chun, who had become not only her attorney but a trusted advisor on business matters that required legal expertise. The message contained a news article about Marcus's former consulting firm, which had struggled to maintain client relationships after Elena withdrew her family's business connections and strategic guidance. The article described Whitfield Consulting's gradual decline as a cautionary tale about businesses built on relationships rather than sustainable competitive advantages. Several former clients had terminated contracts after discovering that the strategic insights they valued had originated from Elena's planning rather than Marcus's consulting expertise. The firm was reportedly exploring acquisition offers from larger companies that could provide the authentic strategic capabilities Marcus had claimed to possess. Elena deleted Chin's message without emotional reaction, having moved beyond anger or satisfaction regarding Marcus's downfall. Her focus was entirely directed toward building something meaningful with the resources and opportunities her grandfather had entrusted to her management. The past existed only as education about recognizing authentic partnership versus exploitation disguised as collaboration. That evening, Elena attended a Chamber of Commerce dinner where she was scheduled to receive recognition for her contributions to local economic development. The award represented acknowledgement from peers who appreciated her commitment to projects that created lasting value for communities rather than simply generating profit for investors. Marcus learned about Elena's recognition through a LinkedIn notification that appeared on his phone while he was reviewing restaurant inventory reports in his studio apartment. The photograph showed Elena accepting her award with the composed dignity he had somehow failed to appreciate during their marriage. She appeared confident and accomplished in ways that had always been present, but which he had chosen to ignore or minimize. The irony was inescapable as Marcus confronted evidence of Elena's professional achievements while struggling to complete basic analytical tasks that challenged his limited understanding of genuine business operations. The empire he had claimed to build was thriving under Elena's authentic leadership, while his current career prospects remained constrained by his actual capabilities rather than borrowed resources. Elena's speech at the chamber dinner emphasized collaborative development and sustainable business practices that created opportunities for multiple stakeholders rather than concentrating wealth among privileged executives. Her vision for ethical business development resonated with community leaders who were tired of extractive consulting relationships that provided expensive advice without meaningful results. Victoria Blackwood watched Elena's recognition ceremony from her own reduced circumstances, having discovered that her association with Marcus had damaged her reputation among potential partners who valued authentic achievement over borrowed status. The lifestyle she had assumed would be hers was now being lived by the woman she had dismissed as unworthy competition. As Elena returned to her penthouse apartment that evening, she reflected on the strange journey that had led from systematic humiliation in a courthouse to recognition as a leader in sustainable development. The quiet strength that had sustained her through Marcus's cruelty had proven more valuable than the impressive presentations and confident rhetoric he had mistaken for business acumen. Elena opened the same leather notebook she had carried to divorce court, now filled with strategic planning notes for projects that would provide affordable housing, infrastructure improvements, and economic opportunities for thousands of community members. The woman who had been dismissed as contributing nothing to business success was building an empire that created lasting value rather than extracting wealth from collaborative relationships. The final entry in Elena's notebook was a simple reminder about the affordable housing project's groundbreaking ceremony scheduled for the following month. The development would house 300 families while providing construction jobs and community services that demonstrated the difference between authentic leadership and the borrowed authority Marcus had wielded during his years of managing her resources. What did you think of Elena's quiet strategy versus fighting back immediately? Let me know in the comments if you think she handled this the right way, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice served. Elena closed the notebook and prepared for sleep, satisfied that justice had been served not through revenge, but through the natural consequences of authentic capability replacing borrowed competence. The empire she was building would outlast any individual relationship because it was founded on genuine value creation rather than the exploitation that had characterized her marriage to Marcus Whitfield.